The photograph arrived in a box that smelled faintly of mildew and attic dust. It was the smell of paper that had outlived the people who'd handled it. The sour tang of cardboard that had been moved from house to house, generation to generation, without anyone being quite willing to throw it away and not quite brave enough to look too closely inside. The box was unmarked, no dates, no names, no careful handwriting on the lid, just a plain brown container that had once held shoes, or canned goods, or something else that didn't matter anymore. Inside, beneath a layer of yellowed tissue, the photograph lay on top as though it had been waiting for this moment. 9 inches by 12, mounted on thick card, the edges bowed from humidity and time. The paper had gone from white to the color of nicotine. The surface crossed with hairline cracks that caught the light when you tilted it. It was heavy, the kind of portrait you didn't get at a 5-cent arcade booth. This had been expensive once, when dollars were rare and luxuries rarer. The year was 1933, but the photograph belonged to an earlier optimism. It showed a family. They were posed in the rigid, formal style of studio pictures from before the crash. The backdrop was a painted suggestion of a parlor. Vague curtains, a bookshelf, something like a column in one corner. The floor beneath their shoes was scuffed wood disguised with a patterned rug. The light was even, deliberate, the shadows soft. Whoever had taken this picture had known the craft and taken the time. There were 5 of them. A father sat in the center in a straight-backed chair, shoulders square, hair smoothed back until it shone. He wore a dark suit that fit too well to be borrowed, a white shirt with a stiff collar, a tie knotted correctly, but a little tight. His hands rested on his thighs, fingers slightly spread, as though the photographer had just told him to hold still, and he'd frozen in compliance. His mouth had been drawn into what might have been a smile or something close enough, but it was impossible now to be sure. His face was gone, not faded, not blurred, not lost to time in the gentle way that silver nitrate softens and edges melt. Gone. Where his eyes, nose, and mouth should have been, the paper had been savaged. A jagged, irregular hole torn straight through from front to back. The damage radiated outward in angry white scratches, as if whoever had done it had started with a penknife or a nail, stabbing and dragging at the surface again and again until the thin layer of image gave way entirely. Around the missing face, the card was buckled and puckered, as though the violence of it had left the photograph itself recoiling. Whoever had done it hadn't stopped after the first cut. You could see the repetition in the pattern of the scars. Parallel gouges running diagonally, some deeper, some more shallow, spiraling out from that empty oval in the center. The torn edges curled upward, stiff with age, exposing the fibrous interior of the card. Tiny flecks of emulsion clung to the scratches like dried blood around a wound. It was not the kind of damage that happens by accident. No careless thumbprint, no glass shatter, no damp corner eaten by mold. Someone had sat with this photograph and made a decision. Someone had focused all the rage or hurt or contempt they carried on to that one small piece of paper, digging and tearing until the face they hated was safely gone. But the rest of the family remained. To the father's right, a woman stood with her hand resting on the back of his chair. Her dress was modest but precise. Dark fabric, simple collar, sleeves that ended just below the elbow. Her hair was pulled back into a neat twist at the nape of her neck. She wasn't young, not anymore, but the lines at the corners of her mouth suggested that she had once smiled easily and often. In the photograph, she was smiling now. It was not a wide smile, not the broad, open grin of someone caught mid-laugh. It was restrained, practiced, the kind of expression worn by women determined to look composed in front of a camera. Because photographs were rare and expensive, and there was no room for foolishness. Her eyes, unlike the father's, were still there. They looked directly at the lens, calm and steady, and maybe, just maybe, the tiniest bit tired. If she noticed that the man beneath her hand would someday be ripped out of the picture, she gave no sign. On the father's left stood a boy, perhaps 10 or 11, wearing knickerbockers and a jacket a size too big. The jacket pulled oddly at the shoulders, as though it had belonged to an older brother, or a cousin, or maybe to a version of himself from a year in the future when he'd grown into it. His hair had been combed with water and parted brutally straight. His ears stuck out. He was grinning, a real grin, teeth and all. He wanted this moment. He wanted to be seen, to be recorded, to prove he had been here in this family at this time, before the world changed again. The Great Depression had already taken so much from people like them. Jobs, savings, houses. But here, in this rectangle of paper, they could still be the kind of family that visited a studio on a Saturday afternoon and sat for a portrait. On the far right, a girl no older than 7 clutched a small doll against her chest. The doll wore a faded dress and had hair that might once have been golden, but now looked gray in the monochrome. The girl's own hair fell in loose waves, held back from her face with a ribbon. Her shoes didn't quite match, one scuffed, one less so, but she held herself with the careful dignity children adopt when told to stand still. Her smile was timid, unsure, as if she wasn't entirely confident she had the right to inhabit this moment. At the far left, balancing the composition, another figure stood slightly behind the father's shoulder. A young man, late teens or early 20s, his features sharper than the rest, his suit cheaper. The lapels sat wrong, the sleeves a fraction too long. His hair was slicked back in the style of the time, but a single lock had escaped and fallen low on his forehead. He looked like he was trying to decide whether to smile or not. In the end, he hadn't quite managed it. His mouth curved, but his eyes were something else entirely. Guarded, wary, almost resigned. All of their faces were clear. Even after decades, their features remained legible, the expressions preserved like insects in amber. Except the father. His absence turned everything else in the photograph into a question. The scratched-out face pulled the eye first, like a missing tooth or an empty chair at a table. Without it, the family grouping felt off balance. The hand on the chair back, his wife's hand, now seemed to rest on nothing. Fingers gently touching a void. The boy's grin pointed toward a blankness. The girl's timid smile aimed itself at a man who no longer existed on the paper. The young man's eyes, the ones that had been wary even before the damage, looked past the ruined oval, as though he'd always known it would end this way. In 1933, across the United States, families were selling furniture and pawning jewelry, and standing in bread lines. Men who had once prided themselves on steady work now stared at their hands and wondered what use they were if no factory wanted them. Photographs, in such times, took on a peculiar gravity. You did not waste money on a studio portrait unless it meant something. Someone had believed this family was worth recording. Someone else had decided that one member of it was worth erasing. The torn edges of the hole suggested it had been done more than once. The initial violence had ripped through the paper, but over time the wound had been revisited. Tiny additional scratches radiated from the center, newer lines cut alongside older ones. As if on some long, angry night, years after the photograph was taken, someone had taken it out again and found that the first defacement was not enough. They had dug deeper, worrying at the edges, punishing the paper for daring to remember. It is one thing to tear up a picture in a fit of rage, to rip and crumple and throw away. It is another to keep the damaged image, to place it back in the box, to allow it to travel outward in time like a piece of shrapnel, carrying with it a wound that never quite closes. The photograph did not say what the father had done. There were no captions on the back, no neat blue-ink names listing who stood where, no date, no studio stamp, just the rough texture of cardboard, and a few fingerprints pressed in so long ago they had merged with the grain. Whoever had scratched out the face had not felt the need to explain themselves in words. The act was its own explanation. But the damage implied intention, and intention implied story. Maybe he had left them. In 1933, men disappeared all the time, out the door one morning with a promise to look for work in the next town, and never came back. Freight trains heading west or south carried more than goods. They carried husbands and fathers and sons who could not bear to come home empty-handed one more night. Some found jobs in distant cities. Some found new families. Some found the bottom of a bottle and stayed there. Abandonment was a kind of death the law could not punish. Or maybe he had stayed and become something worse than absent. Alcohol had a way of turning desperation into cruelty. So did shame and hunger and pride. A man who once sat stiffly in his best suit for a studio portrait, determined to look respectable, might, under enough pressure, become the kind of man whose name his family no longer wanted to say out loud. It was impossible to know. The photograph would not tell. It would sit there in its box, in its heavy cardboard silence, offering only what could be seen. A family arranged around a center that had been violently removed. Smiles that no longer made sense, now that the man they were angling toward had been turned into a hole. A wife's hand, reaching for a shoulder, that was, in the image at least, gone. In the years after 1933, the country would stagger through the Depression, then into a war that would send boys like the grinning son and the wary young man into uniforms and onto ships and trains and foreign soil. The girl would grow up or she wouldn't. The mother would endure or she wouldn't. The father, whatever happened to him, would remain absent from the photograph in exactly the same way, his face an emptiness that refused interpretation. Time would soften the edges of almost everything else. Memories would fray, names would be forgotten, stories would be told once, then twice, then distorted, then lost. Houses would be sold, attics cleared, boxes moved and opened and moved again. People would die. New people would arrive, inheriting things they didn't ask for and didn't understand. Through all of it, the photograph would continue to exist in its narrow, stubborn way. The emulsion might crack, the card might warp, the corners might crumble, but the essential fact would remain. Once, there had been a face here. Someone had known it well enough to hate it. Someone had cared enough or hurt enough to take a sharp object and carve that hatred into the paper until the face was gone. The cruelty of it wasn't in the act alone. It was in the decision to preserve the evidence, This was not a photograph destroyed and thrown away in a moment of fury. This was a photograph disfigured and kept. Every time the box was opened, every time the tissue was folded back, every time someone's fingers brushed that jagged hole, the judgment was repeated. Whoever this man was, he did not deserve to be remembered intact. And yet, paradoxically, the attempt to erase him made him impossible to forget. If his face had remained, he might have become just another stern, sepia father among thousands, his features blending into the generic landscape of the past. By tearing him out, someone had given him a kind of terrible prominence. He was now the absence at the center of the image, the blankness everyone else orbited. The photograph, once meant to freeze a moment of family unity, had become a monument to fracture. Who opened the box last before it arrived here? A granddaughter, perhaps, curious about people she'd never met, tracing bloodlines backward through time. A lawyer settling an estate, dutifully packing up the debris of a life no one wanted to claim. An auctioneer sifting through the remains of a foreclosed house, pulling out whatever might have value. Whoever it was, they had seen the ruined face, the scratched-out oval, the smiling children, the calm wife, the wary young man, and decided, for reasons of their own, not to throw it away. Maybe they felt that getting rid of it would be a second kind of cruelty. Maybe they were morbidly fascinated. Maybe they simply didn't have the heart to discard a family, even a broken one, into the trash. Now it lay on the table under an electric light, much harsher than the soft studio lamps that had first illuminated it. Lines of shadow gathered in the tears. The scars across the center gleamed pale and ugly. The children's smiles looked thinner. The young man's hesitation looked more earned. The photograph said nothing. It offered no dates, no explanations, no confessions. It did what photographs do. It presented a moment and refused to negotiate with what came before or after. All the stories that might explain the missing face existed somewhere outside its borders, in police reports or letters or whispered conversations that had long since faded into silence. All that remained was the evidence of intent, carved into paper. Someone, sometime after 1933, had taken this image and decided that one member of the family no longer deserved a face. The others remained, fixed forever in the act of smiling at a man who, at least on paper, no longer existed. The photograph, mute and stubborn, asked a question it could not answer. What had he done to earn this? And why, after going to such lengths to erase him, had no one ever quite managed to let him go? The law said he belonged to them, whether they liked it or not. Long before anyone took a knife to the photograph, before the cardboard puckered and the father's face became a hole, the lines had already been drawn on paper far older and far colder than the portrait itself. Deeds, titles, an old-fashioned will written in blue ink in a lawyer's precise hand, witnessed and notarized at a time when no one in the family imagined that property could ever become a curse. In 1933, when the photograph was taken, that future still lay dormant. They were just a family, trying to look prosperous in the middle of the Great Depression. Behind the painted backdrop of the studio, the country was staggering. Banks failed, farms were seized, men stood on street corners holding cardboard signs that said, "We'll work for food." But in the frame, they could pretend. The father sat solid at the center. The mother stood beside him. The children were arranged like punctuation around a sentence that felt, in that brief moment, complete. What the camera did not capture was the legal architecture under their feet. The house they lived in, the only thing that kept them from joining the families huddled in shantytowns on the edge of town, did not belong to the father alone. It had been his parents' house first, and his father, a man who believed in order and continuity and the security of bloodlines, had written a will that reflected those beliefs. The property, small as it was, would pass to the eldest son, not to be divided, not to be sold without consent. One roof, one name. The father in the photograph had not always been the man in the center. Once, he had been the younger son. The rightful heir had stood just behind his shoulder. In the portrait, he looked slightly out of place, his suit cheaper, his posture less relaxed. He wore the same dark wool and stiff collar, but on him they seemed like a costume borrowed for an occasion, not clothes that belonged to his life. The photographer had placed him there deliberately, to balance the composition, to fill the space. The family had agreed, because at that time there was nothing dangerous about acknowledging that he existed. He was the older brother, the firstborn, the one who, according to the letter of the will, would one day own the house outright. He was also, as far as the rest of them were concerned, a problem. It had started small, the way so many family fractures do, not with one explosion, but with a series of hairline cracks that no one noticed until the structure was already compromised. He was different, they said, restless, disrespectful. He argued with their father about politics, about religion, about money. He refused to take work at the factory where their grandfather had spent his life. He wanted to leave the town, the state, the country, if he could. He talked about New York, California, Europe, places that existed for the others only as pictures in newspapers. When the Great Depression struck, the difference between him and his younger brother hardened into moral judgment. The younger brother, the man who would sit in the chair in the photograph, stayed. He took whatever work he could find. He mended fences, hauled coal, cleaned out stables. He accepted handouts when he had to and did it with gritted teeth. He came home every night to the same table, the same parents, the same half-cold stew. He learned to make his hunger quiet and his gratitude loud. The older brother left. He caught a ride on a freight train heading north and sent postcards back at first. Brief, breathless notes from Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland. Always the promise, "I'll send money when I can." The money never came. The postcards stopped. Their mother kept his photograph on the mantel. Their father moved it twice, then finally laid it face down in a drawer. When the old man died in 1932, the will surfaced again, like a bad memory. The lawyer was apologetic, but firm. The document was clear. There were no clauses about absence or usefulness or moral worth. The house and the small savings account attached to it, all that remained after hospital bills and debts, were to pass to the eldest son. If he could not be found, the estate would be held in trust for a period of years. Only after that would it pass to the younger. It was law, not justice. The distinction did not matter to the younger brother's wife as much as the practical consequences. They had children now. The 10-year-old boy, the little girl with the doll, and another child on the way. The factory had cut his hours. The relief checks, when they came, were thin. Losing the house, losing even the security of being able to say it was theirs, felt like being pushed to the edge of a cliff. But law was law. The older brother returned for the funeral. He arrived late, wearing a suit that smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and the inside of train cars. He had a scar near his left eye that hadn't been there before. His tie was loosened, his shoes scuffed. He stood at the back of the church, hat in hand, eyes on the coffin. Their mother made a choked sound when she saw him and reached for his hand, like a woman grabbing a lifeline. He held it, gently, as though afraid it might break. The younger brother watched all of this from the front pew, jaw clenched so tight his teeth hurt. Grief and resentment make for an acid mixture. After the burial, they gathered in the stuffy little office of the lawyer who had known their father since boyhood. The older brother sat at the end of the table, shoulders drawn in, as if he'd like to be anywhere else. The younger sat near the center, his wife's hand gripping his knee under the table. The will was read. The words were simple. To my eldest son, I leave the house at 417 Willow Street, and all land attached thereto, to hold in his name as head of the family. The silence afterward was worse than shouting would have been. Their mother wept, quietly. The lawyer cleared his throat and began to talk about options, the possibility of arrangements, of formalizing agreements within the family. Perhaps, he suggested, the elder brother might consider allowing his younger to manage the property while still retaining legal title. There were ways to make it work, but everyone in the room understood the truth that wasn't being spoken. The man who had stayed, worked, sacrificed, and kept the family afloat was not the one the law recognized. The man who had vanished and only drifted back when there was a funeral and a reading was, on paper, the head of the family now. The older brother did not gloat. That was almost worse. He looked stricken. He tried to refuse. "Give it to him," he said, gesturing toward the younger. "He's the one who deserves it." "I've got nothing to—" "It isn't a matter of deserving," the lawyer interrupted gently. "It's a matter of what your father signed. We can draft new documents, but they will have to go through you." From that day on, the house existed in a state of suspended ownership. His name went on the deed, but his presence did not. He took a room at a boarding house on the other side of town instead of moving back in. Pride, perhaps, or shame. He came by on Sundays, sometimes, bringing small gifts for the children, a pocket knife for the boy, a hair ribbon for the girl. Their mother made him coffee and asked questions he answered vaguely. The younger brother watched him from across the room, taking inventory, the calluses on his hands, the wear on his boots, the cigarette burns on his cuffs. Each visit was a reminder that their future depended on a man they did not trust. Dependence breeds a particular kind of resentment, not hot and explosive, but cold and enduring. The younger brother felt it every time he signed his name on a form that still listed his address as tenant rather than owner. His wife felt it when she swept the kitchen floor and thought about how quickly they could be turned out if the elder brother decided to sell. Their mother felt it when she saw the way the younger tightened around the older's presence, like a muscle around a splinter. The photograph was taken the next year, in 1933, not because they were feeling festive, but because the mother insisted. "He is here," she said. "We are together. Your father would have wanted a picture." They went to the studio in clothes that had been brushed and mended and pressed within an inch of their lives. The older brother arrived last, hair still damp from washing at the boarding house sink. The photographer, who did not know the weight of what he was composing, arranged them in what seemed to him a sensible pattern. The father figure, the younger brother, sat in the center. The legal head of household, the elder, stood just behind his shoulder. The wife's hand rested on the chair. The children filled the spaces. Click. For a moment, everything was caught in a fragile balance that looked on paper almost like peace. It did not last. Weeks turned into months. The economic pressure did not ease. The factory cut hours again, then cut positions entirely. The younger brother found himself standing in lines he'd once only passed by. Relief offices, soup kitchens. The older brother picked up odd jobs, here and there, but he did not bring home steady wages. Every conversation about the house, about insurance, about repairs, about taxes, ran into the same wall, his name on the deed. "If anything happens to you," the younger brother's wife said one night, after the children were asleep, "we have nothing. Do you understand that? Nothing. Not even this table." He understood. That was what made it unbearable. He began to see his brother not as a person, but as a verdict. Every time the older man walked up the front steps, the boards creaking under his weight, the younger brother's stomach tightened. Every time he heard his brother's laugh from the kitchen, or saw his mother's eyes soften when she looked at her firstborn, something sour pooled in his chest. Love and obligation and resentment tangled together, until he could no longer tell them apart. It didn't help that his brother seemed determined to absolve himself. "I'll sign it over," the elder said more than once, "as soon as I have something of my own. I just need to get settled. Find something permanent. I don't want to leave myself with nothing." The words were reasonable. Reasonable words can be the most infuriating kind. You cannot argue with reason without feeling foolish. You cannot demand that someone make themselves homeless for your security without hearing, even in your own mouth, the echo of selfishness. So the younger brother said nothing. He swallowed it. He said, "I understand." And each time he said it, he meant it a little less. Silence became its own form of betrayal. The children felt it, even if they didn't understand it. The boy noticed how his father's jaw tightened when his uncle ruffled his hair. The girl noticed that when uncle came to dinner, mother's laugh got brighter and father's eyes got duller. Their grandmother tried to hold them all together with Sunday roasts and memories, but memories have less weight than signed documents. The house, which had once felt like a shelter, began to feel like disputed territory. And in the center of every argument, every whispered conversation at night, every tense pause at the table, every heavy silence after a visit, was the same unavoidable fact. By every measure of law that mattered, the older brother was the rightful heir. He carried that fact like an invisible badge. The younger brother carried it like a chain. When the mother died, the last buffer between them disappeared. There was no more excuse to gather, no more pretense of unity for her sake. The older brother came to the funeral, stood at the back of the church again, walked behind the casket to the graveyard. The lawyer attended as well, offering formal condolences. After the burial, there were papers to discuss: taxes, repairs, a stack of envelopes from the bank. "Maybe it's time," the lawyer suggested gently, "to clarify the arrangement, given the circumstances." The circumstances were simple. The younger brother's family lived in a house they did not own. The older brother owned a house he did not live in. The bank, indifferent to blood and history, expressed concern about outstanding notes. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of situation in which resentment and fear breed decisions that look from the outside like cruelty. No one remembers who took the photograph out first. Maybe it was the younger brother's wife, restless and bitter, sorting through drawers late one night after the funeral, looking for something to hold on to that still felt solid. Maybe it was the younger brother himself, drunk on cheap liquor and exhaustion, dragging the box from the closet as if to prove something to himself about who belonged where. Maybe it was the boy, now older, flipping through old pictures and stumbling upon that frozen moment he could barely remember. In the dim light of the kitchen, the faces stared up from the card. The mother's calm smile, the children caught mid-hope, the younger brother sitting in the chair, stiff, with the effort of looking like what he wished the world would acknowledge him to be. And behind him, the rightful heir, present, unavoidable. The knife, if it was a knife, did not strike flesh. It met paper. There is a particular satisfaction in making the first cut across an image you have come to hate. The resistance is slight but real, the emulsion giving way under the point, the fibers of the card parting with an almost inaudible hiss. The line appears where there was none before, a white scar slashing across a familiar face. Once the first cut is made, the others follow more easily. Again. Not enough to tear the photograph in two. Not enough to make it impossible to recognize who had stood where. Just enough to remove the one element that had become unbearable to see. You could call it childish. You could call it petty. You could also call it, with some honesty, an attempt at self-defense. They could not kill him. They did not even, in their more honest moments, want him dead. His death would have complicated everything. Wills to be probated, estates to be argued over, questions to be asked. Death draws in outsiders, lawyers, judges, sometimes police. Death is public. Erasure, on the other hand, can be private. On the deed, his name could not simply be scratched out. The law did not recognize rage as a legitimate instrument. But in the small republic of the household, the photograph was their document, and they could edit it as they pleased. They could not make the bank forget him. They could make themselves forget his eyes. Paper is poor armor against reality, but it is excellent for rituals. Every time someone opened the box after that, every time they saw the ruined oval where his face had been, the message repeated itself. He does not belong. Not here. Not with us. Not in the story we tell about who we are. They kept the picture because destroying it entirely would have felt too much like admitting what they had done, not just to the photograph, but to the man whose legal existence they could not escape. As long as some version of the image remained, they could pretend that whatever had happened was a small thing, a moment of temper, nothing more. But the absence at the center of the photograph said otherwise. The law refused to forget him. The family refused to remember. Between those two refusals, the heir who had once stood behind his brother's shoulder became something else entirely. Not a person, but a problem to be managed, a risk to be minimized, a face no one wanted to see. And so, with an object as small and blunt as a kitchen knife or a nail or the tip of a pair of scissors, they did what the courts and the banks and the notarized documents would not allow. They erased him, not from the world, but from the frame. He wasn't dead. That was the worst part. If he had died, there would have been a date to write in black ink and underline twice. a funeral to attend or pointedly skip, a headstone to visit or refuse to acknowledge. Death is final, and the living know how to arrange themselves around it. A space opens, a story closes. People say, "He's gone," and the words, spoken often enough, gradually harden into truth. But the air was alive. They knew it, even when they pretended not to. Letters arrived in shaky handwriting with unfamiliar postmarks. His name surfaced in conversations with people from the boarding house, from the rail yard, from the bar on the edge of town. Someone's cousin ran into him in Chicago. A man from the union swore he'd seen him at a protest in Detroit. He existed in rumors and third-hand sightings, like a ghost that hadn't had the courtesy to die first. The law kept insisting on his existence, too. Tax forms still bore his name at the top. Notices from the county clerk arrived twice a year, folded crisply, the ink indifferent. To Mr. A. Name, owner of record, 417 Willow Street. The envelopes were addressed to the house he did not live in, delivered to the brother who did. The mailman, who didn't care about family politics, shoved them through the slot all the same. The younger brother learned over time to open them without flinching. He paid what needed paying, signed what needed signing. He wrote the heir's name where the line demanded it, his own in smaller script below, marked acting on behalf of. Every time his pen formed those letters, it felt like a humiliation pressed into paper. Outside those forms, they began to practice pretending the man didn't exist at all. It started with small omissions, introductions that skipped a generation. "Our father built this house," the younger brother would say, speaking to neighbors, to the priest, to anyone who admired the solidity of the place. He never added, and left it to his oldest son. In the telling, the house passed straight from father to him in a neat line, the way houses did in simpler stories. The children absorbed the edited version without question. When the boy asked once, early on, why uncle didn't live with them if it was his house, the younger brother's wife had smiled too quickly and said, "He doesn't want to. He likes traveling, that's all." Her voice had the tight, bright ring of something said, for the first time, that would eventually become a script. As years went on, the script improved. When people asked how many children their grandparents had had, the answer shifted. 3 sometimes. The younger brother and the 2 sisters who had married out of town. Sometimes 2, depending on who was listening and how sharp their memory was. The oldest son's name, once said easily, began to catch in throats. When their mother died, it was written on the notice sent to extended relatives. Survived by her son, Thomas, and 2 daughters. The name that should have stood first didn't appear at all. It wasn't a mistake. It was the first official document in which he had been actively omitted. The younger brother read it over before it went to print and did not reach for a pen. You could call it an oversight. You could also call it the first public act of erasure. The world outside the house still had traces of him. Old school records in the county office, listing him as student grade 8. A photograph in a yearbook, his face younger, unsmiling, staring out from a grid of other faces. A faded entry in a church ledger, baptism, confirmation, attendance at Sunday school until age 14, when his name simply stopped appearing. Records, if you knew where to look, insisted that he had once been a boy who existed like any other, present, counted, noted. The town did not erase easily. Paper kept memories long after people let them go. But inside the family, the silence was deliberate. When the boy grew older, he noticed the gaps. He'd ask a question. What was Dad like when he was my age? And an aunt would start a story that, by its shape, clearly belonged to someone else. Halfway through, she'd catch herself, change a name, tug the memory into a new shape. The seams showed. People stumbled over pronouns. Your father and I, the boy learned not to ask too directly about before. The answers made the room colder. The photograph became the one place where the missing man could not be denied. There he stood, on the left, behind the seated brother, frozen in the act of almost smiling. His presence was undeniable. You couldn't tell yourself a story in which he had never existed while looking at that picture. The image was too clear. The composition made his importance obvious. He balanced the frame, shadow, to the younger's light. That made the photograph dangerous. The first defacement, those initial savage scratches across his features, took away the immediate problem of his face. Now when you looked, you saw not the man but the damage. The eye went first to the violence, then to the absence. It was easier perversely to ignore him as a person, when all that remained of him was a hole and a suggestion. But paper once altered doesn't heal. It waits. At first, the ruined picture felt like a private shame. The younger brother's wife kept it in the bottom of the drawer with other things she didn't want visitors to find. Old letters, unpaid bills, the marriage certificate from a first engagement that had never become a wedding. Occasionally, something else would be needed from the drawer. A birth certificate, a handful of savings, carefully folded in a handkerchief. And the photograph would surface. Each time the damage looked fresh. The torn fibers had stiffened, the white edges yellowed, but the act itself seemed new whenever it came into the light. It didn't lose its sting with repetition. If anything, the opposite happened. The more the family tried to live as though the heir had never existed, the more accusatory that missing face felt when it stared up at them. For a while they avoided looking at it at all. Years passed. The boy became a teenager, then a man in his own right. Work remained scarce. The younger brother's back began to ache in permanent ways. His wife's hands grew knotted from scrubbing and mending. The depression eased, slightly. Then the talk in town shifted from soup lines to war. Roosevelt's voice crackled over radios in kitchens and barber shops. Newspapers carried photographs of distant places that threatened to become immediate. The heir, wherever he was, grew older too. Sometimes a letter arrived with no return address. The handwriting, more cramped now, carried news in fragments. Found work for a time at the mill. Thinking of heading west. Heard mother passed. Couldn't get back in time. Never a direct question. Never a demand. Letter after letter closed with some version of the same line. Hope you and the children are well. Hope, coming from a name they had half convinced themselves no longer counted, felt like an accusation. The younger brother did not burn the letters. He also did not answer them. He folded each one carefully and placed it in the same drawer as the photograph. Over time, the stack thickened, paper pressing into paper. The face on the photograph remained scratched out. The words on the letters remained legible. It was as if, in that narrow, dark space, two opposing realities coexisted. A man utterly erased from the visible story, and a man who stubbornly persisted in ink. Silence can be louder than any shouted insult. By not replying, the family spoke a clear sentence. You are not one of us. We do not owe you acknowledgement. Your life continues, but not here. Outside their walls, when strangers asked about relatives, the younger brother would say, "No brothers," with enough casualness that no one thought to question it. In time, he came to believe it himself, or at least to function as if it were true. That's what social erasure is. Not the immediate blotting out of a person, but the gradual filing down of their edges until they no longer catch on speech. Yet the law, indifferent to hurt feelings, continued to send its reminders. In 1940, a notice came requesting the owner of 417 Willow Street to register for property reassessment. The younger brother, now grayer at the temples, took the letter to the county office. The clerk read the name, glanced at him, and asked the question that nobody at home dared voice. "Is he deceased?" There was a brief, sharp temptation to say yes. One syllable could make the world match the story they'd been telling themselves for years. One word, and at least the paperwork would align. The urge rose so strong he felt it in his teeth. But lying to a clerk felt different than lying by omission to neighbors. There were consequences, forms, possible investigations, the risk of discovery. "No," he said, voice tight. "He's away. I handle things." The clerk shrugged, unimpressed. "Then we still need his signature, or power of attorney." A form was slid across the counter, another layer of reality pressing back. That night, the younger brother opened the drawer again. The photograph lay there, waiting. He took it out and set it on the table. The edges of the hole were familiar now, as known as the shape of his own knuckles. The initial scratching had been wild. This time his movements were slower. He traced the torn oval with one calloused finger, then reached for the small paring knife that lay beside the bread. Carefully, almost delicately, he began to shave away more of the image. The gouges spread, deepening, extending beyond the face into the collar, the tie, the background. He worked methodically, breathing through his teeth. He was not trying to destroy the whole photograph, only to make absolutely certain that every trace of that particular man was unrecognizable. Where there had once been the suggestion of eyes and nose, only raw paper remained. A ritual, once performed, is easier to repeat. From then on, whenever some reminder of the heir's legal claim intruded, another letter from the county, another rumor of his presence in a nearby town, the younger brother or his wife would find themselves returning to the photograph. There was always some small area that could be further damaged. A stray shadow of a jawline, the arc of an ear, the slight indentation where his cheek had once been. Each fresh wound brought a momentary sense of control. Here, at least, they could make the world match their preferred story. Here, right on the kitchen table, there existed a piece of reality they could alter without consequence. If they could not keep his name off official documents, they could keep his face out of sight. The children, now young adults, understood the ritual without ever being taught it. The boy, at 19, found the photograph once when his father was not home. He had heard half-arguments through thin walls, seen the tension in shoulders when an envelope arrived with unfamiliar handwriting. He knew better than to ask too many questions. But seeing the picture, he recognized immediately whose absence had been carved into that empty space. He had seen his uncle once by chance on the street. Older, thinner, a little stooped, but unmistakable. Their eyes had met. Neither had spoken. The encounter hung between them like a held breath. Now, with the photograph in front of him, the boy picked up a pin from the sewing basket. He pressed it, hard, into the area where the missing man's eye would have been, twisting until the paper ripped. A tiny, precise violence. When he was done, he put the photograph back exactly where he'd found it. No one mentioned the new hole. No one needed to. Erasure became a family language. By the time the war came and took the boy in uniform to places his uncle had once talked about going, the heir's existence inside the house had shrunk to 3 things: the line on the deed, the letters in the drawer, and the ruined space on the photograph. Every few years, a new attack would be made on that space. Sometimes it was anger that drove it. After a returned envelope stamped undeliverable, after a letter from a lawyer reminding them that as long as the elder brother lived, the property could not be transferred without his consent. Sometimes it was fear, when rumors of soldiers' deaths made the wife wonder, in a cold sweat, what would happen if her son died overseas while the house still legally belonged to a man who might decide to sell. Sometimes, disturbingly, it was almost casual. A bored hand while waiting for bread to bake, a restless evening with nothing to do, and the radio murmuring news of places far away. The photograph would come out, the knife or pin would appear, and tiny fragments of paper would drift down like snowflakes onto the table. Each mark said the same thing, over and over. You are here only because we cannot kill you. You are nowhere we choose. The heir, for his part, continued to exist stubbornly in the world beyond their narrowed horizon. He worked, on and off. He got sick and recovered. He lived in rooms that weren't quite home. He thought sometimes of returning to 417 Willow Street for good, of walking up the front steps, of knocking and not leaving until something changed. Each time, something, pride, shame, fatigue, stopped him. He did not know about the photograph. He did not know that more than once his brother's hand hovered over the box after one of his letters arrived, then dropped away without opening it. He did not know about the pinholes, the knife marks, the way his absence had become the one shared project that still united the family, that refused to speak his name. He thought he had been forgotten. The truth was colder than that. He had been remembered so intensely that the remembering itself had turned into a sustained act of destruction. To kill a man would have been cleaner. There would have been grief, yes, and perhaps guilt, and certainly consequences. But the story would have had a clear end point, a date, a cause, a grave. To erase him while he lived required more work. Every holiday, when the table was set and an extra plate might have been placed where his seat should have been, someone made sure there were exactly enough dishes, and no more. Every time census takers knocked and asked, "How many people live in this household?" the answer was trimmed to fit the new narrative. Every retelling of the family history sanded his name further away. The photograph, damaged as it was, remained the one honest witness. It did not lie. It did not adjust its story to make the living more comfortable. Under all the gouges and holes, under the repeated layered scratches, the ghost of his likeness still existed chemically in the emulsion, a latent image that could never be entirely extracted without burning the card to ash. The torn shape proved, with brutal simplicity, that someone had once stood there. Years later, after the war, after the boy returned home with new lines on his face and a quiet that hadn't been there before, after the younger brother's back finally gave out and the wife's hands grew too stiff to wield knives, the photograph migrated again. It ended up in a box with other effects slated to be moved or sold or thrown away. The house changed, paint peeled, new cracks appeared in the walls. The legal situation remained absurdly the same. The heir, now an old man somewhere nobody could quite pinpoint, still owned on paper what he had never inhabited in practice. One rainy afternoon, when a distant cousin came to help clear out a closet, the box was opened. The photograph lay on top, as it had when it first surfaced. He lifted it carefully. The card was brittle. The air smelled of dust and mildew. The ruined oval in the center drew his eye the way it always did. He ran a thumb lightly over the torn edges, feeling the ridges of layered violence. He could not know the whole story. He could only read the surface, the smiling children, the composed woman, the seated brother, the shadow of a young man obliterated, but still stubbornly implied by the void where his face should have been. As he tilted the card, light from the narrow window fell across it at just the right angle. For a heartbeat, the gouges and cuts caught the light and seemed to deepen into 3 dimensions, the torn paper casting tiny shadows of its own. The empty oval darkened, becoming not just blankness, but a pit, a small private grave dug into cardboard. Around it, the others kept smiling, fixed in their moment, unaware of what the years would do to them. In that instant, the photograph held 2 realities at once. The day in 1933, when a family stood together in a studio, and all the deliberate forgetting that had happened since. The living man whose legal claim refused to vanish, and the ritual wound his absence carved into paper. The cousin shivered without quite knowing why. He put the photograph back in the box, face down this time, the ruined side pressed against the cardboard bottom. Even hidden, the image lingered. An empty space at the center of a family, buried, but not gone, waiting in the dark, as if listening for the sound of a knife being picked up again.